Hello, everybody. We are continuing on in our study, and this section is called The Challenge by Jesus' Brothers, and it is found beginning in John chapter 7, verses 1 to 9. Chapter 7, verse 1 says this, quote, "After these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him." MacArthur says that there is a 6-month gap, most likely, that took place between chapter 6 and chapter 7 of John. While chapter 6 occurred around Passover, as chapter 6, verse 4 says, and that is, Passover occurs around April. Chapter 7, now verse 1, as we've just read, occurs at the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, which is in the fall or around October. John wrote nothing about those months, what was in between those months, since his purpose was not to present an exhaustive chronology of Christ's life, but to portray him as the Messiah and Son of God and show how men reacted to him. Now in verse 2, John 7, verse 2, quote, "Now the feast of the Jews, the Feast of Booths, was near." Well, the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles was associated in the Old Testament with the ingathering of the harvest of grapes and olives. You find that in Exodus 23, Leviticus 23, and Leviticus 30, as I said, Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 16. While grain was reaped between April and June, the Feast of Tabernacles occurred for 7 days. It is the longest festival of the Jewish year, held in early autumn after the Jewish New Year and the Day of Atonement, so it follows those two holidays. It was a celebration of God's gracious provision for the Israelites in the wilderness and the completion of the year's harvest. There was a ceremonial water drawing commemorating the provision of water in the wilderness, to which Jesus makes a reference when he says, quote, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." That's later on in John 7, verse 37 to 38. And the feast includes also a lamp lighting ritual to which Jesus makes a reference, saying, quote, "I am the light of the world," in John 8:12. According to Josephus, this feast was the most popular of the 3 principal Jewish feasts, which are Passover, Pentecost, and Booths or Tabernacles. People living in rural areas built makeshift structures of light, branches, and leaves to live in for the week. Town dwellers put up similar structures on their flat roofs or in their courtyards. This occasion raised an issue from Zechariah, the prophet Zechariah, chapter 14, verses 16 to 21, which explains what the Jewish people believed, and that is, they knew that the Feast of Tabernacles was to be fulfilled by the Messianic kingdom. So Jesus' 4 half-brothers challenge him to go to Jerusalem and make himself king in fulfillment of these verses, saying in John chapter 7, verses 3 to 4, quote, "So his brothers said to him, 'Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you're doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly.' If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Matthew 13, verse 55 lists Jesus' brothers as James and Joseph and Simon and Judas. James, as we know, authored the New Testament epistle of James and became the leader of the Jerusalem church, and Judas, or Jude, wrote the epistle that bears his name. Because of Jesus' virgin birth, they were only half-brothers of Jesus, since Mary, not Joseph, was Jesus' only human parent. Well, this challenge they made to Jesus rose out of unbelief. Quote, this is John 7:5, quote, for not even his brothers believed on him. They were saying this, if you really are the Messiah, go to the Feast of Tabernacles and make yourself king, as Zechariah 14 predicted. Jesus' brothers wanted him to put on a display of his miracles. Although the text does not clearly state their motivation, perhaps they made the request for two reasons. One, they wanted to see the miracles for themselves, to determine their genuineness. They may have had similar political motives as did the rest of the people, namely that Jesus would become their social and political Messiah. Another reason that they might have told him to go and do this, perform this display, was Jerusalem's acceptance of him was to be the acid test for them as to whether his own family would believe him as the Messiah, to be the Messiah. As with the crowds in Jerusalem and Galilee, even his own brothers did not believe in Jesus at first. They did not become his followers until after the resurrection, and that's in Acts 1:14. Jesus answered in John 7:6, my time is not yet here, but your time is always opportune. This recalls the response to Jesus' mother that Jesus' mother made to Jesus at the wedding in Cana. My time is not yet here. And that's what he's saying and repeating again here to his brothers. The appointed time for Jesus to fulfill Zechariah 14 had not yet arrived. Well, Jesus would not go to the feast because it was not God's perfect timing. Jesus was completely dependent on and committed to the Father's sovereign timetable for his life. Furthermore, Jesus never committed himself to being motivated by unbelief, even that of his own half-brothers. Well, why did Jesus say to the brothers, but your time is always opportune? Well, because Jesus' brothers did not believe in him, they were of the world and therefore knew nothing of God or his purposes. Because of unbelief, they did not listen to his word, did not recognize God's schedule, and could not perceive the incarnate word before them. As a result, any time would do for them, preferably that moment. John 7:7 says, quote, the world cannot hate you. Jesus said this to the brothers. The world, meaning humanity, in its opposition to God and his purpose. The world, humanity, hates me because I testify of it, that its deeds are evil. Evildoers resent being unmasked by the good. The world cannot hate Jesus' brothers, because they belong to the world and the world love its own. That's John 15, verse 18 to 19. In verse 8, Jesus says to them, quote, "You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time is not yet fully come." Jesus would not die at this Feast of Tabernacles. When he said, "I do not go up to the feast," it did not mean that he would not go there at all. It meant that he was not going to leave right away. He was not going in response to their challenge to make himself king. That could not happen in light of the fact that the nation had rejected him. This was not the time to set up the kingdom. In verse 9, he says, quote, "Having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee." The brothers left and Jesus stayed in Galilee a while longer. Only in the next segment will we see that Jesus began to move towards Jerusalem for the observance of the feast. He recognized the danger he would face in Jerusalem. So in this next section of the harmonies, it's the journey to Jerusalem, and this incorporates some of Luke's gospel because Luke gives more details as Jesus now is going to continue on. The Messiah left for Jerusalem, but not in response to the challenge of his brothers. He went on the basis of his own motivation, his own program, his own plan. The assumption is that the Father had directed Jesus to go to Jerusalem at this point. John 7:10 says, quote, "But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private." The secrecy of his journey indicates his maximum discretion, which was the complete opposite of what his brothers had demanded of him. For the continuation of this journey, we need to now go to Luke, who includes more details about this journey Jesus makes. This begins a major section of Luke's gospel. From here, Luke 9:51 to Luke 19, verse 27, Jesus' face was said to be set towards Jerusalem, and Luke's narrative is a travel log of that long journey to the cross. This was a dramatic turning point in Jesus' ministry and shows the Messiah's determination to complete his mission of going to the cross. Now, Luke 9:51 says this, quote, "Now it came to pass, when the time had come for him to be received up," that is Jesus, "that he steadfastly," Jesus, "set his face to go up to Jerusalem." Guzik says that in Isaiah 50, verse 7, that verse speaks prophetically of the Messiah, the suffering servant. Quote, it says this, "For the Lord God will help me, therefore I will not be disgraced. Therefore I have set my face like a flint, and I know that I will not be ashamed." This is Jesus who steadfastly set his face like a flint, as Isaiah wrote, going to Jerusalem. Jesus hardened his face, not in the sense of becoming a hard or angry man, but in the sense of having focus and having focus through a difficult time. Jesus sees the difficulty ahead and steadfastly marches towards it. He saw the cross on the horizon. Matthew Henry comments that there was a time fixed for the sufferings and death of our Lord Jesus, and he knew well enough when it was and had a clear and certain foresight of it. And yet, instead of trying to avoid this time, it was then he appeared most publicly of all and was most busy, knowing that his time was short. When he saw his death and sufferings approaching, he looked through them and beyond them to the glory that should follow. He looked upon it as the time when he should be received up into glory, received up into the highest heavens to be enthroned there. Moses and Elijah spoke of his death as his departure out of this world on the Mount of Transfiguration, which made it not intimidating, but Jesus went further and looked upon it as his translation to a better world, which made it very desirable. All good Christians may consider the same notion of death and may call it their being, quote, received up, to be with Christ where he is. And when the time of our being received up is at hand, let us lift up our heads, knowing that, quote, our redemption draws near. Because of the joy set before him, Jesus steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem, the place where he was to suffer and die. He did not fail, nor was he discouraged, knowing that he should not only be justified, but be glorified. He was fully determined to go and would not be dissuaded. He went directly to Jerusalem because there his business lay. 1 Timothy 3:16 says, quote, and without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up in glory. Jesus knew that this would be the last Feast of Tabernacles he would ever be a part of in this world. This celebration marked the beginning of the last 6 months of his life. And to ensure that preparations were made, Luke 9:52a says he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him. Well, Jesus wanted to go up to Jerusalem by way of Samaria, but as it turns out, that wasn't going to work out. Jesus and his disciples would strain the resources of a small village if they were to drop in unexpectedly, so Jesus gives due notice, but it is met with the traditional hostility of the Samaritans for the Jews. The Samaritans did not trouble Jews who came down from Jerusalem and passed through their territory, but they did not want Samaria to be used as a thoroughfare for Jews going up to Jerusalem, the rival city of Mount Gerizim. So, while Jesus had not been harassed when he passed through Samaria on the way from Jerusalem, he now encountered problems. Luke 9:53, quote, but they, the Samaritans did not receive him because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. The messengers that were sent in advance were rejected and were not allowed passage through Samaria. This was a display of Samaritan animosity toward the city. According to Josephus, Samaritans were even known to kill Jews passing through Samaria on the way to Jerusalem. Here, they merely refused to give Jesus passage through their country. Well, the disciples responded negatively to this. Luke 9:54, quote, "And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, 'Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did?'" Well, James and John judge that the insult done to God's Messiah deserves the same immediate destruction. There was something commendable, for they showed a great confidence in the power they had received from Jesus. Secondly, it showed a great zeal for the honor of their master. And yet here they're going to ask Jesus' permission. They submitted to their master's goodwill. "If you will, Lord, do you want us to?" Well, these, quote, sons of thunder, as they were called, nicknamed by Jesus, they were wanting thunder and lightning to come down. In other words, that's in Mark 3:17, they were eager to defend their master's honor. Well, Elijah did the same thing in 2 Kings chapter 1, verse 10 and 12. They had done it upon the soldiers that came to take him, not once, but twice. But Jesus had never, on any occasion, called for fire from heaven. No. He even refused to give the Pharisees any, quote, sign from heaven when they demanded it. That's what they were demanding of Jesus, to bring fire down from heaven, but he wouldn't do it. John will later become known as the Apostle of Love, but that was not the way he responded here. Here he is portrayed with a very different attitude, which just shows us how much his life changed as a result of the death and resurrection of the Messiah and of the infilling of the Holy Spirit. Well, Jesus' response to the brothers' question was negative. Luke 9:55, quote, "But he turned and rebuked them and said, 'You do not know what manner of spirit you are of.'" Surely, in other words, you have yet to learn, though you have been so long in learning, what the Spirit of Christ and Christianity is. The purpose of Jesus in his first coming is not to impose God's judgment on others, but to endure God's judgment for others and bring them healing and life. Have you not been taught to love your enemies and to bless them that curse you, and to call for grace from heaven, not fire from heaven upon them? You're not under the dispensation of bondage and terror and death, but under the dispensation of love and liberty and grace, which was ushered in with a proclamation of, quote, "peace on earth and goodwill towards men." And to which we have to take heed. This was John's second sin against charity, in other words, not showing love in a short period of time, because just a little while earlier, John told Jesus that when he had seen someone casting out devils in his name and tried to prevent him because he did not follow along with us. Well, Jesus goes on in verse 56. quote, "For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went to another village. Matthew Henry comments here, Jesus designed to propagate his holy religion by love and sweetness and everything that is inviting and endearing, not by fire and sword, but by miracles of healing, not by plagues and miracles of destruction, as when Israel was brought out of Egypt. Jesus would have his disciples do good to all, to the utmost of their power, to hurt no one, to draw men into his church with the bands of love, not to drive men into it with a rod of violence or the scourge of the tongue. Messiah's response to the Samaritans exemplifies the attitude the church ought to have with regard to all forms of religious persecution. Okay, and Romans 13:4 talks about civil government and the right of the government to inflict, I guess, judgment, right? It's the duty of government to judge wicked people, but not the church, in other words. Because it says in Romans 13:4, quote, "For he is God's minister to you for good." This is the government. "But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil." Well, Elijah was specifically authorized to measure out the reprisal of God's wrath when he called fire also down on the prophets of Baal. But Elijah did not act in a capacity that parallels that of the ministers of the gospel. So Jesus bypassed Samaria, taking a longer route via Perea, east of the Jordan River. Jesus retreated from the village. He would not only not punish them for their rudeness, he would not attempt to force his way, but quietly and peaceably went to another village where they were not so stingy and bigoted. Note, Matthew Henry, continue on with him, when a stream of opposition is strong, it is wisdom to get out of the way of it, rather than to contend with it. If some be very rude, instead of revenging it, we should see whether others will not be more civil. Good lesson learned. The next section is concerning discipleship. You know what? I'm going to stop right here, and we will continue with our next lesson. Thank you, and God bless you. Next, we'll speak about discipleship, which comes next. God bless you. Take care.